They were barely 18, but the law called them terrorists. In the heart of Nairobi, sirens screamed louder than the chants. Inside the courthouse, iron bars cast long shadows over young faces. Boys in school shoes, girls in borrowed jackets. They didn't carry weapons. They carried hopes. Now they stood accused of terror. Outside, chaos wore a mother's face. Screams pierced the air. Fathers knelt on concrete. One woman, barefoot, trembling, raised her hands to the sky and cried, "Set my son free, or I will undress before the world." What happens to a country that fears its children more than its corruption? When did peaceful protest become a punishable offense? And who benefits when the courtroom becomes a theater of fear? President William Ruto's government calls this justice. But former Chief Justice David Maraga calls it what it is, a war against youth. If they can silence a generation this young, who will speak next? If this is Kenya today, what's to stop it becoming any of us tomorrow? This is more than a trial. It's a mirror, and the reflection is terrifying. If you believe Africa deserves to see clearly, follow this channel. Stay with us. For truth they hope we'll forget. It began like many days of hope do, in the streets. On July 7th, 2025, the anniversary of Saba Saba, Kenya once again awakened to the rhythm of resistance. Not soldiers, not gunfire, just thousands of feet marching through Nairobi, Kisumu, Mombasa. Youth moved as one, not in rage, but in remembrance of the promises made and broken. They didn't come with weapons. They came with dreams written in bold ink: justice for all, jobs not jail, Kenya belongs to its people. Was that too much to ask? Was fairness now a threat? University students linked arms with street vendors. Young mothers sang as they pushed strollers past tear-stained walls. Street kids marched beside lawyers. A nation's future was in motion, united in its demand for dignity. But by midday, the songs were drowned by sirens. Tear gas burst into the air like silent thunder. Rubber bullets tore through chants. What kind of leadership answers a peaceful call with force? What was the government afraid of, placards or truth? From alleyways and armored trucks, riot police emerged like shadows. People scattered. Some ducked behind buses, others fell. A girl was dragged across tarmac. A boy clutched the flag before being struck down. Under the watch of President William Ruto, the streets of Nairobi transformed from hope to horror. Police claimed it was a necessary intervention, but what was necessary about dragging teenagers into vans with no warning? What law justifies beating a child for lifting their voice? By nightfall, over 100 youth were arrested in Nairobi alone. The Kenya National Commission on Human Rights confirmed 532 arrests across the country. The charge? Terrorism. There were no explosives, no conspiracy, no plans of sabotage, only a generation tired of watching its future auctioned away by broken politics. But instead of answers, they were given cages. And the question grew louder. When did protest become proof of guilt? Who decided that the Constitution ends where courage begins? In the confusion, silence fell. Not peace, but pressure. Parents waited outside stations. Lawyers demanded access. But access was denied. Phones were confiscated, names withheld. Was this justice, or an experiment in fear? Even former Chief Justice David Maraga could not ignore it. Speaking to press, he didn't hesitate. These are not prosecutions. These are punishments for speaking. His words rang clear across the city, but would the courts listen? The sky darkened. Placards lay abandoned, streets emptied. But the question refused to fade. What kind of country jails its children for dreaming? And then, from near the courthouse wall, a voice broke through, the kind that doesn't tremble anymore. A young man no older than 20, bruised but upright, whispered, "We are not afraid. We are just tired. Tired of watching dreams crushed in courtrooms." Inside the grey walls of Nairobi Remand Prison, the echoes weren't of hardened criminals, but of boys calling for their mothers. They were teenagers, some barely out of secondary school, locked behind rusted bars, their futures paused in mid-sentence. Some had never spent a night away from home. Now they slept on cold floors, sharing cramped cells with strangers twice their age. There were no explanations, no briefings, just one word stamped on their case files: terrorism. How do you process that when you're 18? When you were carrying a placard, not a weapon? When all you ever wanted was to be heard, not hunted? At the court in Thika, bail was set at 100,000 Kenyan shillings, nearly a year's income for an average household. Most families didn't even have access to banking systems. One boy whispered to the social worker, "My mother doesn't even have a bank account." Another teenager stared blankly ahead, saying nothing, until he broke down crying during roll call. President William Ruto's administration justified the charges as security precautions. But what kind of security criminalizes poverty? What safety demands silence from its own children? These were not criminals. These were students. Street hawkers, job seekers, all thrown into the same legal furnace, branded with the same accusation. No lawyer stood for them during initial hearings. The public defenders were overwhelmed, unprepared, and in some cases absent. One 19-year-old was separated from his cousin and placed in solitary confinement. No charges read, no rights explained. What happens when law forgets its duty to explain? Another youth, 17, was allegedly beaten during transport from Nakuru to Nairobi. His parents only learned of his whereabouts after a journalist posted his name on social media. Why should a mother have to scroll Twitter to find her son? And still, the silence from the state was brutal. Names were withheld, locations obscured. The Ministry of Interior declined to comment. Families were told to wait. Meanwhile, inside those holding cells, a different kind of story was unfolding. Hunger, despair. Some began hunger strikes, others carved messages into the cell walls, pleas, prayers, names of home villages. What else could they do when speech had been caged? Legal experts began warning. Applying the Prevention of Terrorism Act in this way violates the spirit of Kenya's 2010 constitution. But no judge overruled the accusations. The word terrorist had already done its damage. Once said aloud, it clung to their identities like dust to skin. In another case, a boy from Eldoret had marched carrying a sign that read, "My voice matters." He was taken, held for days without contact, and only allowed a single phone call, monitored, timed, and cut short when he mentioned his school principal's name. What lesson does that teach about voice? A 19-year-old from Mombasa with sickle cell anemia was denied access to medication during his initial 72-hour detention. His mother stood outside the gate with his medical file. The guards didn't even look up. Since when did paperwork plead for mercy? What does it mean to be dangerous in Kenya today? Is danger defined by the absence of money, the presence of dreams, or the courage to speak aloud? A 16-year-old girl from Kisumu was detained in a cell with no female guards present. Her offense, live streaming the protest on her phone. She was questioned for hours, then left alone without sanitary supplies. Her parents were not informed. Her schoolmates only found out when her photo appeared on a flyer calling for her release. In Nairi, a youth leader who had previously volunteered for civic education workshops was charged as an organizer of coordinated unrest. He had no megaphone, no funding, only a notebook filled with handwritten quotes from the Constitution. The Ministry of Youth Affairs remained silent. The Kenya National Human Rights Commission issued a brief statement, but it was quickly buried under headlines about foreign investment and presidential travel. Inside the courtrooms, the language remained sterile. Subjects under inquiry, pre-trial risk evaluations. But outside at the gates, a mother screamed her son's name until her voice cracked. Outside the courtroom gates in Nairobi, the air felt thicker than smoke. Dozens of parents stood shoulder to shoulder, mothers barefoot, fathers with trembling hands. Some held photos of their children, others clutched rosaries. The sound wasn't just of grief, it was disbelief. How had justice become so cruel? How had Kenya learned to treat its children like criminals? They had gathered before dawn. Many hadn't eaten, some hadn't slept. But hunger didn't matter, only freedom did. A woman, elderly and barefoot, collapsed to her knees. Her hands pounded the concrete. She shouted her son's name again and again. Beside her, another mother removed her headscarf, threatening to strip entirely if her daughter was not released. Dignity meant nothing when your child was behind bars. What was shame compared to silence? One woman cried out, "I gave birth to a boy, not a terrorist." Her voice cracked, but her stance did not. A father knelt in the center of the road, blocking traffic. He held a school report card in his hand. "We worked to keep him in school. Now they call him violent." His voice was not angry, it was broken. A teenage sibling passed around bottled water and whispered, "They haven't eaten in days." Another clutched a scribbled prayer on a piece of cardboard. It read, "God, bring them back." Amid the tears and tension, an older woman stood tall with a Bible pressed to her chest. She began to sing. Her voice, raw but resolute, cut through the noise. "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah." Within seconds, others joined. Mothers, fathers, strangers. They didn't need sheet music, just pain and memory. As you read this, pause with us. If your heart aches with theirs, comment Amen below and share your prayers for justice. Let your voice stand with theirs. Buses honked, police watched from behind shields. But the hymns kept rising, words spread fast. By nightfall, hundreds gathered. Some brought candles, others brought food. They came from Kibera, from Mathare, from Machakos. They came not just for their own, but for every youth locked in a cage they didn't deserve. Some held signs. "Where is justice? Children are not criminals. We will not forget." Even as authorities insisted the arrests were legal under President William Ruto's administration, the streets told another truth. This wasn't law. This was heartbreak dressed in uniforms. A pastor from the local Anglican parish led a prayer on the sidewalk. "Lord, protect our children from the hands of fear," he said, his arms raised toward the grey sky. Several collapsed into his arms. Others whispered their own pleas. Unpolished, unfiltered. Journalists filmed. NGOs took notes. But it was the faces that told the truth. Wrinkled brows, bloodshot eyes, lips moving in prayer. It was not a protest. It was a vigil. A group of women formed a circle, hands locked. One said, "We are not going anywhere." Another added, "If they don't release them, they'll have to arrest us too." And still, the state remained silent. No officials addressed the crowd, no charges were clarified. Courtrooms delayed hearings again and again. Behind the walls, their sons waited. Outside the gates, their mothers refused to leave. When asked why she had come, one grandmother said it plainly. "If they jail the young, who will build this country when we're gone?" It began with legislation. The Prevention of Terrorism Act, introduced to combat extremism, was never meant for teenage protesters carrying cardboard signs. Yet in Kenya, it has become a net cast wide, ensnaring not just threats but voices. Government spokespersons cited public safety and national interest to justify the mass arrests during the Saba demonstrations. They argued the state had a duty to prevent unrest before it escalated. But who defines unrest? And since when did demanding education or jobs qualify as subversion? President William Ruto's administration stood firm. "No one is above the law," one official said. But if the law now includes children with no criminal records, no weapons, and no legal representation, what exactly is being protected? The use of anti-terror laws to detain over 500 citizens, most under 25, has sent ripples far beyond Kenya's borders. Human Rights Watch condemned the move, warning of a growing trend in East Africa of using terror laws as tools of suppression. Amnesty International called it a clear violation of proportionality and justice. Former Chief Justice David Maraga broke his silence in a press briefing. "These are trumped-up charges, not justice but intimidation." His words echoed across newsrooms and into the streets. What the state fears is not bombs, it fears voices. Legal experts across Nairobi pointed to a dangerous precedent. By broadening the scope of terrorism laws to include peaceful demonstrators, Kenya risks normalizing a permanent state of emergency, where civil liberties are suspended at will. A lawyer representing several youth detainees explained, "They are being charged under laws meant for armed insurgents. No explosives, no coordination, no weapons, just words, just chance. It's not about proving guilt, it's about creating fear." In the courtroom, prosecutors demanded denial of bail, citing national threat. Judges, often under pressure, obliged. The youth were sent back to overcrowded cells, some for up to 14 days without a formal hearing. What message does it send when legislation becomes a leash, when a government equates dissent with danger? Protesters shouted slogans. They did not shoot bullets. They demanded fairness. They were met with tear gas, detention, and silence. A civil rights professor from the University of Nairobi noted, "This is a method of legal erosion. You don't break the constitution in one night. You chip at it, one protest at a time." As the state doubled down, public fear grew. Would attending a rally land you in jail? Would sharing a video count as incitement? Was activism now a crime? The National Council for Civil Liberties reported at least 63 cases of prolonged detention without trial following the protests. In one instance, a 19-year-old student was held for 10 days before being told he was under review. In Eldoret, a lawyer recounts being barred from meeting a detainee because his credentials weren't cleared for terrorism. In Kisii, a family was told their daughter's file had been misplaced and to return next week. In Nakuru, a teenage boy was released after 9 days without charge. Yet no apology, no compensation, no record cleared. The silence from the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions was deafening. No clarification, no defense. Just the ticking clock of unprocessed cases and youth waiting in cells. A new term emerged on social media: legalized disappearance. When the law doesn't need to kill you, just erase you quietly behind locked doors. One advocate summarized it best: what starts with protest ends with prison, if we don't speak. On the morning of July 9th, just 2 days after the mass arrests, a small conference room in Nairobi's Upper Hill filled beyond capacity. Journalists, law students, retired judges, and rights activists packed shoulder to shoulder. At the front of the room, flanked by stacks of hastily printed case files, stood a coalition of independent lawyers. "We will not let them stand alone," one advocate declared, voice cracking slightly under pressure. "If the government insists on making these children into criminals, it will have to arrest us too. Why must it always fall to citizens to remind the state of its own constitution?" The Kenya Human Rights Commission had already flagged the arrests as legally disproportionate and politically motivated. Amnesty Kenya called for immediate bail hearings and full transparency. International attention was growing. Statements from Human Rights Watch and the UN Human Rights Council demanded access to detention facilities and clear evidence of terrorism claims. But the real push came from the ground. Within 48 hours, over 200 legal professionals had signed up to represent the detainees pro bono. Mobile money platforms were flooded with donations. Teachers pooled salaries. Alumni groups launched crowdfunding pages. "If they jailed our students," one principal tweeted, "we will bail them out." In Eldoret, a local mosque collected funds after Friday prayers. In Nairobi, artists hosted poetry nights to raise awareness. Farmers from Nyeri sent food parcels to families camped outside the courts. It wasn't just about money, it was a declaration. These youth were not alone. How many acts of kindness must it take to undo an act of political cruelty? Among the lawyers was Mzee Tom Wambua, a 73-year-old who had once been jailed under the Moi regime for defending university activists. Now, decades later, he adjusted his old brown coat and entered the courthouse once again. Not as a defendant, but as a shield. "I recognize this script," he told a local reporter. "Back then, they called us communists. Today, it's terrorists. The name changes, the fear tactic doesn't." In court, Wambua argued for the release of a 17-year-old charged in Mombasa. The boy had no prior record, no evidence against him, and had been held without counsel for 5 days. His only possession at the time of arrest? A copy of the Kenyan constitution. Since when did carrying your rights make you a threat? During a break in proceedings, Wambua stood in the hallway, hands clasped behind his back. "They jailed me in '88, he said. "I stood again. These children will stand again." Behind him, a new generation of lawyers watched and nodded. They weren't just fighting for clients. They were fighting for the right to believe that law could still mean protection, not punishment. And across the courthouse walls, posters began to appear. Handwritten by families, stuck up by students, passed around by friends. One message repeated quietly and steadily: "We hold the line." Not all defenders wore suits. A retired teacher from Kisumu stood outside the courthouse gates each morning, holding a sign that read, "My students are not terrorists." She had taught many of those arrested, knew their handwriting, their family struggles, their dreams. "I've seen them study in candlelight," she told a journalist. How dare anyone call them a threat? In Garissa, a retired magistrate offered his living room as a coordination hub for volunteer advocates. He no longer held a gavel, but his walls were lined with decades of law books, and his phone never stopped ringing. From here, appeals were drafted, affidavits reviewed, and hope stitched together word by word. How many elders must rise before the young are allowed to stand? This was never just about a protest. It was never only about arrests or courtrooms. This is a reminder, sharp, urgent, and unflinching, that the right to dissent is not a luxury. It is the backbone of freedom. Across the dusty roads of Nairobi, the echoes of July 7th still linger. They live in the silence of school desks left empty, in the tears of mothers whose sons did not return, in the fear of young Kenyans who now hesitate before they speak. And what happens when a generation stops speaking? When young voices are caged, who will sing for tomorrow? In this moment, elders across Africa, those who once marched in the civil rights movement, who were called disruptors, agitators, radicals, may feel a familiar sting. This is not just Kenya's reckoning. It is a mirror held up to the black diaspora, to those who have known what it means to be feared for dreaming. Can we still recognize the language of oppression, even when it speaks through suits and court files? President William Ruto has not publicly addressed the heart of this matter. The country waits, the continent watches, and the youth, Gen Z, restless and relentless, continue to rise, not with stones, but with slogans. Not with guns, but with questions. How many must be punished before we admit the law has forgotten its purpose? How long before silence becomes complicity? To our community around the world, what does this moment reveal about William Ruto's vision for Kenya's youth? What legacy will remain, his silence or his sentence? Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you say to a young protester in Kenya today? What would you say to Ruto? What would you say to your younger self? Drop your reflections below, and if you stand with the youth, type "Rise Africa" in the comments. If you believe in stories that fight for getting, stay with us. Share this video with someone who once stood for something, who still believes in something, who refuses to be quiet. Follow our channel for stories that remind the world Africa doesn't need saving. Africa needs amplifying. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story.